Okay, formerly it was the Papua territory and the New Guinea territory. So in this lecture, we are going to look at the colonial impact of Papua New Guinea from 1945 to 1978. Okay, so let's look at the lecture objective here. Now the reading has already been uploaded. Within the reading, the reading will discuss these three important points here. The reading will try to talk about the differences between the forms of colonialization. Okay, the first form was the classical colonialization, and the second form is the neoclassical form of imperialism or colonialization. Secondly, the chapter reading will try to identify the role of colonial state. Now this is important because we are moving away from the capitalist discussion on colonialization, and we are moving towards a state-centered colonialization. And this is where we are going to talk about the role of Australian government, or the role of Australia as a nation, or the state of Australia in handling the affairs of the territories. And lastly, we are going to see how multinational companies or corporations in the later stage of the particular period from 1945 to 1978, how they sort of shape economic development. So basically, we are going to look at the new form of colonialization. Number one, we are going to look at the role of the colonial state, and then we are going to look at the introduction of the multinational companies, corporation in Papua New Guinea. Okay, so let's move on. So from 1978 up to 1975, okay, this is classified as the neo-colonial imperialism, or the phase of the neo-colonialization. The classical colonialization was taking place from 1884 to 1945. Now, in order to understand the classical colonialization, the classical form operates on the notion of you have a very big, let's say, business enterprise, companies established. We have establishment of what is called the stations, where they start to build in, let's say, plantation and export goods. So from 1884 to 1945, these were mostly sponsored by large companies, okay, business interests. Okay, the state did not have any role in the development from 1884 to 1945. So here you see the classical colonial exploitation, the plantation economy in Papua and New Guinea. The focus is extraction of raw materials. This includes the gold rush in the 1920s, okay, coffee, cocoa, tobacco. These were all geared for export. So exploitation, you can say, to export those raw materials to the world markets. Again, here, the periphery, this is where the extraction took place, okay, and export to the center, okay. Now, the characteristics of this era from 1884 to 1945, so direct political control of Papua and New Guinea by Australia and German powers, exploitation through plantation and mines, and gold rush in Bololo, New Britain plantation, Just an example of it. However, importantly here is that there was no emphasis on local industries. We've talked about the idea of preferential treatment, where certain commodities, for example, sugar, was not allowed to be produced in Papua, because if you have a sugar plantation in Papua, that will affect the sugar industry in Queensland. So preferential treatment sort of limits local industries. So during the classical period, there was no promotion of any local industries or manufacturing industries. So just like Industrial Revolution in Europe, okay, in that period, there was not so much of encouragement to do so in Papua and New Guinea territory. In the next phase, which is the neo-colonial imperialism, started from 1945 to 1978, the focus now shifted away from direct political control to indirect economic and political control. Now, formally you have companies coming in and starting to make laws. Okay, the companies were given freedom and authority to exercise their power within Papua and New Guinea. When you have, in the new phase, we have an established government system. Okay? Now, so there is some level of political control or structure in the way they were, or in the way they are doing things, okay, from 1945 to 1978. So the focus here, indirect economic and political control. The characteristics of this period here: economic dependence through trade and finance, mostly through infrastructure, support for limited industrialization, or lack of support for industrialization, use of multinational corporations for economic influence. I'll give you an example. In the first period, you have the New Guinea company coming and setting a plantation system. The New Guinea company in itself are now responsible to develop infrastructure. For example, building roads. So you go to East New Britain, for example, you will see East New Britain has a very good road networks connecting, okay, the region. You can't find that here. Let's say if you look at the legacy, okay, of this example here in East New Britain, and you compare that to Papua region, you will see good road infrastructure networks in Port Moresby. Obviously, that is the capital. You will not see that good infrastructure when you travel down to Abau. Okay? So the example here is that the former, where you have plantation economy, there is some example of economic development as far as the infrastructure is concerned. So here, if you read through the second phase, the second chapter, always look at these themes here to guide you to understand what is going on during this period here. Now, key difference here is that, and we'll look at the key difference, okay, control mechanism, direct versus indirect political control. Now, example of an indirect political control after 1945 is that you have Waigani, all right, establishment of a government office in Waigani, and then, or rather, Konidobo, and then you have patrol officers, okay, going around setting up village court, kiabs, walking around the country to sort of socialize or not colonize, to sort of modernize the natives. Okay, so that is an example of an indirect political control during this period. Most of the power is concentrated at Konidobo. Now, in looking at these two phases here, economic focus, The first colonial period from 1884, the first phase is more concentrated on material extraction, all geared towards economic or export, okay, economic interest. So this period from 1884 to 1945 is all geared towards exportation of raw materials. After that period, 1945 to 1978, you have limited industrialization, and we'll talk about that. The focus is now moving away from the plantation system or more economic focus, but diversify, looking at the overall political control of the colony. Okay, so classical colonial exploitation versus neo-colonial imperialism. Okay, so the first period, again here, important here, is that it is dictated by the classical colonial exploitation, more towards exporting the raw materials. In the next phase here is neo-colonial imperialism. And that is more of limited industrialization and more of political control. Now, let's look at the neo-colonial imperialism in Papua New Guinea. The focus is geared towards indirect economic and political control. Example, the Australian colonial state, 1918 to 1975. And the characteristics of this indirect economic and political control are: number one, economic dependence through trade and finance. So when the Australian government took over 1945 and established Papua New Guinea territory in 1949, their sole focus was more on political control than economic development. So their idea was to have a political control in charge of the economic affairs of the country. So having the Australian state or the governor in charge of the economic control of the country. In the previous era, you don't have a governor or established political authority. It was the companies that were in control of the economic activity or the economic affairs. So how do they have, let's say, control over the economic affairs of Papua New Guinea? Formerly during that time was through aid grants. All right, in our time we call it foreign aid, but during that time or that period was through the state-sponsored budget, okay, through the Australian government. Why is this important? It's because we are still dependent on this structure today. We're heavily dependent on the Australian government for aid funding. This was established during the neo-colonial imperialism era in Papua New Guinea. So the Australian colonial state started to sponsor infrastructural development in Papua and New Guinea territories through the office of the governor. Okay, the governor was the sole authority or the sole figure that is in charge of political and economic authority in Papua and New Guinea territory. As a consequence of that, Papua and New Guinea territory saw a lack of support for industrialization. More focus was on mineral and resource extraction, timber, fish, and copper. So from 1945 to 1978, the legacy here did not change after independence. And this is why it's important that you read through this chapter here to see detailed examples of how neo-colonial imperialism was playing out during this period, because it sort of shaped the future of post-independence Papua New Guinea. Number one, it will tell you that this is where Papua post-independence New Guinea, or after independence, we are so much reliant on the state to fund the economic development or the infrastructural development. The idea of the SIP started here. And thirdly, the use of ore. Secondly, because of absence of any export-based agriculture, for that matter, or diversification of agricultural sector, the gradual shift towards resource extraction started in 1945 and not after independence. Because the colonial authority their focus was on limited industrialization, that led them to look at short-term extraction. And then not your oil, gas, our gas, timber, and fish become the sole focus for that short-term gain. All right? And this is where it invited the multinational companies to come in. Why do we need the multinational companies to come in and do business in the country? Because we invited them. Because we, in our plan, our government plan, the structure of it is geared towards resource extraction. Now, the legacy issue started in 1975. All right, sometimes we like to blame Prime Minister James Marape, Peter O'Neill, late Grand Chief Sir Michael Sumare. Without understanding the structural issues here, we might not appreciate why these things are happening. Okay? So here, the economic focus from 1945 to 1978 was on raw mineral extraction. This is because of lack of industrialization. By way of development, the political economic aspect of it, industrialization comes after agricultural or agrarian or agricultural development. The need to export will come only after there is a much established agricultural sector. So absence of agricultural sector after 1945 shift the focus away from agriculture to mineral resource extraction. And then Papua New Guinea was dependent on mineral resource extraction after 1975. So please go and look at that reading. It gives you a good example in examples that will really make sense of what I'm trying to talk about here. Okay, so the next part is that from 1945 to 1978, saw an increase in state presence, okay, the colonial administration. Now we look at the role of the colonial state in the economic development. So from 1945 to 1978, the colonial state started to take charge of the economic development. Because of weak agricultural base, and also our agricultural industries were affected by shortage of labor, even the land itself, our land itself, the tough geographical terrain itself was not conducive for growing commodities, the temperature, the climate, all these things contributed to the state becoming responsible for economic development. Now the purpose of it is that the Australian colonial administration wanted to at least develop the territory's economy. So the purpose was to foster the economic growth and stability in Papua New Guinea. And their objective, the colonial government state objective, was to create a favorable condition for Australian businesses to invest and operate profitably in Papua New Guinea. Carry on the legacy from the Australian mercantile system, which promoted Australian business interests, that carried over after 1945. So the sole purpose of the colonial administration was to sponsor Australian business interest in the territory of Papua and New Guinea, knowing well that any other business interest will hinder Australia's interest in developing the Queensland economy. The impact is that it aims to make PNG a stable and profitable environment for Australian companies. So the idea was to have Papua New Guinea or Papua New Guinea territory, okay, as a backup for the Australian economy. And that is where the idea of preferential treatment comes in, where, let's say, if Australia falls short of producing cattle, a good way to offset the shortage of cattle production is to open up cattle market in Papua New Guinea so that it support and sustain the Australian cattle industry. Okay, that idea of preferential treatment. Because this is important here. Why are we not producing rice here? Do you know that our rice is imported? Do you know your oxen palm is imported? A lot of things that is in Papua New Guinea at the moment now is imported. Now, the economic structure that was set up made it in such a way that after independence, Papua New Guinea became a import-dependent economy. Now, to support business interests, the colonial state started sponsoring business activities. And this comes through in the form of the Australian aid. All right? Aid supports PNG's development while facilitating Australian business expansion. Okay? And we are still relying on foreign aid even after independence. I'll give you an example here. You look at the Australian aid to Papua New Guinea from 1940 to 1975. From 1940, it was about 95,000 Australian dollars. 1944-45, this rose up to 500,000 Australian dollars. 1947 went up to 4 billion, and then 27 billion. By 1975, when Papua New Guinea was about to get its independence, the Australian foreign aid in supporting Papua New Guinea's political and economic sector rose up to 143 million. Now, why is that? This is an important indication that Papua New Guinea, after independence, relied heavily on aid, foreign aid from Australia. Now, key points here is that significant increase in Australian aid from 1940 to 1975. Okay, Somalia government did not create this foreign aid issue here, or even James Marape, or even Peter O'Neill. Now, an important aspect of this increase in foreign aid is the expansion of the bureaucratic machinery. All right? The increase in funding from Australia also led to the increase in the centralization of government system. Waigani or Colonial began to expand. When it began to expand, the wages and salary of the public servants began to expand as well. And second, that led to the second point here, state expenditure prioritized over export production in post-war capitalist development. Because the government had to sponsor economic development, the money was coming through foreign aid. That led to a dependent relationship on the colonial state government. They were too busy trying to pay the public servant salary, trying to build roads through the foreign aid, that they forgot to develop necessary infrastructure or economic infrastructure for industrialization or for economic development or for as a foundation for the export-based economy. Okay, to build any sort of export-based economy. So the consequence of this high spending here affected Papua New Guinea's ability to export. Now, increase in foreign aid here secondly led to an import-dependent territory from 1945 to 1978. Okay, let's look at other issues. Okay, apart from the increase in Australian government grants to the region from 1945 to 1978. Okay, World War I, World War II, okay, came and gone. During that period, the Australian administration wanted to revive the plantation economy. Okay, it's not saying that they were not interested in developing our country or our economy, but it's just their priorities has affected, okay, necessary development to our economic structure. And although they want to revive the plantation economy, so after 1945, the colonial state wanted to focus on developing the plantation system. However, that was met with some challenges. One of that was during the war, the plantation infrastructures were heavily being bombarded, destroyed by the war itself. And although monies were put into reviving it, the issue was that the infrastructures were affected, and secondly was that the pool of laborers, most of them were out helping the war effort, that by after World War II, there was not enough labor to work on those plantations. Now the challenges of it is that the labor challenges, okay, by that time dried up labor supply. Even though government effort was going into trying to revive those plantations, there was not enough people to work on those plantations. Some of the villagers were reluctant to go and work on the plantation. So by 1945, that needed a policy change. Okay, Australia, and also during the time, the black bedding, slavery was abolished, and having to have a labor was not conducive. Okay, quite rather expensive. Where everywhere they were, okay, around the globe, they were sort of making labor slave. Okay, indentured slave become absolute. And that's so, okay, by 1945, the Australian Labor government cancelled all labor contracts. That also affected the territories. So indentured laborers were, the contracts were cancelled, they had to return home. And in replacement of that, they started to increase the minimum wage for the laborers, or those that were, okay, working on those plantation, okay, the surviving plantation during the time. Okay, reduce in working hours, increase ration. So you can see policy changes were also affecting labor supply. So policy changes, the global policy changes, in effect, were trying to stop, okay, the labor supply, not to stop, but discouraging, okay, people working on plantation. So all those policy changes lead to the skyrocket of labor cost. Okay, now it's very hard to recruit a labor, okay, to work on those plantations. So labor cost increased, and that led to significant economic pressure on the plantation system. Now, why is this important? Because the post-war period, the policy changes which affect the labor affected those plantation, or the colonial government effort to revive the plantation. Now, the overall consequence of that is that it affected the agricultural economy again. Okay? So the agricultural economy was affected, okay, starting in the first colonial phase and the second colonial phase as well. Now, the issue in Papua New Guinea during the time, Papua New Guinea territory, we have, okay, abundance of capital, big money coming in from the Australian government, but labor shortage. There was not enough labor to work on those plantations. And the politics of that time discouraged any, or the politics of that time increased the cost of labor. This affected the growth of agricultural sector. Up until the 1940s, that was temporarily addressed through the discovery of the islands region. So the focus by 1940s, when all the islands region was discovered, the Australian colonial government thought that now they have a potential in sourcing labor supply from the islands region. And that led to the 1950 Islands Labor Scheme. So we have about some 1,000 people coming from the highlands region to work on those plantations. Now, by 1968, the highlands region made up 62% of the labor supply, okay, those working around the plantation. Now, although labor supply, we did have other commodities doing well, coffee, copra. And during that time also, we have cocoa production. After World War II, 1940s, there was a high demand of cocoa and copra production. So it is also during that time, the demand for cocoa and copra started to take shape. And that also continued after independence. So Islands region was able to offshoot some of those labor challenges and sustain the copra and cocoa industries in the two territories. And in addition to that, the Islands region now became profitable area. Discovery of the islands region saw the coffee boom, establishment of settlers in the islands region, and then you have the coffee plantation. The coffee plantation did not start in the coastal region, okay, not until the 1940s. After the 1940s, the Australian government saw access to fertile valleys, and that attracted, okay, white settlers in the islands region. Okay, if you're from the region, you would notice, okay, there is existence of this coffee plantation, and sometimes it's associated to a white, let's say, business or settlers during the time. So why am I going through all these figures here and talking about this? Okay, if you read, you will see an effort in trying to revive the agricultural sector or the agricultural economy, the export-based economy. So there is genuine commitment towards exports. After the mineral prices dropped, okay, focus now, okay, shifted to coffee and cocoa. So from the 1950s to 1960s, an increase in exports, okay, for that particular commodity, coffee and cocoa and copra. And this also encouraged both peasant and plantation-based production. Okay, you have now village people started to participate in coffee production. Also, you have settlers and planters coming in to participate. Now, in that period, okay, the administration also started to try to diversify. So you have the big businesses of Benz Philip, carpenters and steamships focusing on shipping routes now have shifted their attention to plantation, all supported by the Australian government. I believe in Madang, there is, probably the plantation is there, sponsored by carpenters, now probably sold off. But the important thing to grasp here is that this colonial state government involved in trying to stimulate the agricultural sector. Now there is a pattern here. When there is a decline in the gold or mineral extraction, when there is a decline in market value, the shift tend to go back to the agricultural sector. When there is an increase in the value of extraction, mineral extraction, the shift tend to go back to the mineral sector. And you will see here, when the discovery of LNG came in 2007, the Somali government left the export-based strategy of focusing on agriculture, running towards the mineral extraction. So if you read the chapter here, you would notice some legacy issues that are still present today. Now let's look at the important aspect, from 1970s onwards, how that role of the Australian state government in the economy, and the creation of the legacy issues after 1975. Number one, shifting dependence. From Australian imperialism, the Australian imperialism or the state role was relying on the big companies for commercial activities. Now, relying so much on those big companies sort of undermine the growth of vital industries in the two territories. Now, because there is limited, let's say, participation, the big threes operating or in charge of commercial activities here, that saw the need for multinational companies to come in. So the multinational companies was invited by the state to come in. So from 1970s onwards, there was a shift, from the over-reliance on state-sponsored economy towards now relying on the multinational companies or corporations. Dependency shifting to the multinational companies. So from 1945 up until the 1970s, the Australian government, the Australian colonial state were using Australian companies, the big three they call it, Benz Philip, steamships, and the other. For, you can say, its economic, in terms of developing the economy, these three big companies were in charge. Now, 1968, our political independence started in 1949, 1964, 1972, when the country is gearing towards independence, the colonial state administration started to pull back much of its support. So when that happened, there was a gradual shift of relying on the Australian aid or the Australian, let's say the Australian money or the Australian capital, now moving away to the multinational corporation and their big capital coming in. So Australian state subsidy increased in Australian government funding from 18.89 million, 1956-57 to 186 million in 1975. That led to a decrease in proportion. subsidy proportion to total government revenue decreased from 70% to 40%. What it's trying to say is that if you read to the later part of the chapter, it will tell you that in anticipation for self-government, the Australian government started to pull away significant funding and support, okay, away from, okay, the self-government by 1973. But what they tell you is that when Australia pulls away the money that it pulls away, that leaves the government of Papua New Guinea, okay, reliant on foreign aid. So Australia did not pull away foreign aid. It sort of changed the meaning of a kind of foreign aid. Now, I'll give you an example of Australia started to pull away from, or pull its support away from the colonial administration administering Papua and New Guinea territory. Number one, in the 1960s, they introduced the income tax, the introduction of the income tax. Why? The introduction of income tax is another way the government will benefit. Okay, you pay your taxes, the government uses your tax to build roads, bridges, schools, etc. So 1960 introduction of income tax is an indication of Australia government anticipating independence and started to pull away most of its support. Now, this has a consequence. We've talked about the labor challenges. And the labor challenges started in the two phases, from 1884 to after 1945. Now, if you introduce income tax, who are the population that are going to pay taxes? Most probably the public servants. And with the shortage of labor, people working on a plantation, by 1975, the government had limited tax revenue base to begin with. The Australian government secondly started to try to push in economic growth, building infrastructure, investing more in infrastructure. That's one of the reasons why the Australian aid money started growing exponentially from 1960s to 1975. They were trying to prepare Papua New Guinea for independence. So with weak-based system and Australian government pulling away, the most likely resource that the government of let's say, Grand Chief Sir Michael Somalia will rely on is to look for natural resource extraction. The available means of which enough revenues can be generated is from the natural resource extraction, and that is where Bougainville copper mine comes in. The government depended heavily on Bougainville copper mine, that they did not care about negotiating the royalty benefits, so that both parties can negotiate on equal terms. So the government, in anticipating independence and given the difficulty to meet the budget, went ahead and negotiate unfairly, in the Bougainville copper agreement. And that unequal negotiation led to the conflict in Bougainville. But here, the structural conditions of our country from 1945 to 1975 made it in such a way that natural resource extraction was given prominence, and that saw the introduction of the multinational companies coming in. Okay, so here, by 1960s, the Australian government started to pull away its support. In anticipation of that, the rise of multinational companies started coming in. And those multinational companies were going after copper and gold. That saw the increase of investment by the multinational companies. And on top of that, the over-reliance on foreign assistance. So from 1956 to 57, the territories, Papua and New Guinea, were over-reliant on foreign aid for Australian grants. By 95, 75, 76, Australian subsidies, 90% of foreign aid. So by 1975, the Australian government supported its Papua New Guinea's budget. So by 1975, 76, 78, the then Somare cabinet opted to look elsewhere towards the multinational corporation. Now that started off, okay, the over-reliance on government loans. Okay, infrastructure and export projects, roads, ports, all these telecommunication, our infrastructures now, we're at the mercy of multinational companies through the resource extraction and foreign aid. Why? Because by 1975, Papua and New Guinea territory cannot, okay, generate enough revenue and capital internally. So what the best thing the government would do is to go and borrow to support, okay, the budget and the domestic economy. That is why the government has been over-reliant on borrowing, and then our debt kept on increasing. Okay, infrastructure and productive investment financed through tied loans, untied loans, UBSA loans, all these kinds of loans from China, Exim Bank loan. Okay, this is not part of or solely the responsibility of James Marape, Peter O'Neill, Grand Chief Sir Michael Somare. These are all structural issues. When you have an import-dependent economy like Papua New Guinea, who are heavily reliant on imports coming in, okay, the government is inclined to borrow to support the deficit in budget. All right? So, our taste for Coca-Cola, rice, oxen palm, quick guy, mobile phone is feeding into this dependent economy as well. Okay? You can't go back to the village and start to eat taro and all those organic food. Okay? You are still reliant on your rice and chicken. So, from 1945 to 1975, important characteristics of the state, or important characteristics of the political economy of Papua New Guinea. Number one is the heavy reliance on state support, the Australian colonial state support. Number two is weak export base. And number three is reliant on multinational companies. All right? So you have the three themes or three ideas here that will help you try to understand the structure of Papua New Guinea's economy. On Thursday, we're going to look at the political, political or ideological basis for the Australian colonial government from 1884 to 1975. But in these two lectures here, especially the second lecture our second lecture discussion. Importance emphasis, please go and read the article or the reading here. It gives you important concepts that will be useful in understanding Papua New Guinea's political economy. Okay? So with that, we'll cover that in our lectures, tutorial classes this week. On Thursday. So this is week 4. You'll have your first quiz on week 6 and your test 1 on week 8. All right, with that, class dismissed.